think very few people saw the genuine Benny Hill, because I think he had this facade that he dropped down to protect himself.
The idea that's been fostered in the press that he was a lonely man. Lonely is entirely the wrong word. Loving your own company is not lonely.
Money didn't mean anything to Benny at all. He used to have cheques arrive through the post, and he just used to leave them lying around the flat. He couldn't even be bothered to actually bank them many times. He used to say, well, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a piece of paper.
He was leading a life, a selfish life, really, the kind of life that I think probably we'd all like to have secretly. But he lived it as he wanted to, and with great success.
Benny Hill was born in Southampton on January the 21st, 1924. The second child of Helen and Alfred Hill, he was christened Alfred Hawthorne. Benny was his mother's favourite, but had an uneasy relationship with his father.
He was very, very close to his mother. I'm not so sure about the father, because he always adopted a slightly different feeling when you talked about the father, so you got off it very quickly.
I think his dad was so much of a different generation. I mean, if there's ever been a generation gap, it was the one between Benny and his dad. Because his dad was really a sort of Victorian father who was always giving advice. I wouldn't do that, my son. Now, my son, this, he'd say. And I never heard him talk about his dad laughing.
The young Benny spent every Saturday afternoon at Southampton's Palace Theatre, where he began to foster the ambition of breaking into show business.
He tells me he remembers sitting there in the theatre, and there was the funny fat man came on, and all the girls around him, and the audience laughed, and they cheered, and they clapped, and everybody loved him. And Ben said, I sat there, Dan, and I said, that's who I want to be. The man who makes everybody laugh and is loved by everyone. Because he didn't get it from his family. And indeed, that's exactly what he did.
In 1941, aged 17, Benny left Southampton for London and began to perform in theatres and nightclubs. One of his co-stars at the time was comedian Bob Monkhouse.
You know, I think Benny was never comfortable with a live audience. I don't think he ever liked it. I don't think he liked the smell of them. Because even on those rare occasions I saw him do a warm-up for his own television show, he would still do the same jokes. He would still go out and say, oh, yeah, well, I come from a family, we used to ship bulls. We used to ship a lot of bulls. In fact, we were the biggest bull shippers in the country. And another thing I'd like to tell you about my family is this. I must say, you may think that's a load of bullocks, and it certainly was a rather large number of bullocks when you think about it. So he did the strange muttering business underneath, so as not to let everything die and go silent.
Having decided that live theatre was not for him, Benny turned his attention to the new medium of television, where he pioneered a style of comedy which paved the way for a whole new generation of comics.
I think when he was 27 and starting off writing scripts for television, he first of all had the insight to know that television was going to be extremely popular, whereas a lot of people didn't. It was still variety, it was still musical, and he had this perception of television. He knew it was going to be the main thing in people's living rooms.
Please don't blame our doggy, it's not his fault at all. Someone left a wet umbrella standing in the hall.
You only had to look at a television camera, the glass melted, and he was there in your living room. That magical power, very few comedians have had it, ever.
Oh, mother.
Indigestion? Then take a couple of bennies.
Acid is the cause of most upset stomachs, and this acidity can be measured. A couple of bennies will soon put you right.
Feeling better?
I feel fine now.
I think we were probably the first show that sent up other shows. Things like Film Night, where they'd look at the work of continental directors and you know, you can get a lot of fun out of that if you worked it the right way.
Then one day, into my life came Barbara. She was the most beautiful creature I'd ever seen. She had the face and figure of a lovely young girl with the deep, understanding eyes of a deeply sensuous, full-blown woman.
He loved mime. He was very into mime, and this is why he spent such a lot of time on the continent, where they've perfected that.
You can see in Benny's work, particularly the early work, a tremendous amount of the kind of thing you'd see at the Folie Bergère or the Crazy Horse. Little sight gags, little bits of business, things that no other British comedian would ever have attempted. we were all so censored, we couldn't use words like bloody, or you get, and that was live TV, and you just get fired if you used a coarse word. And so Benny went as far as he dared, and somehow because of the naturalness of it, because it felt right, Benny was allowed to be saucy.
He had a cheeky look. He always looked as if he was doing double entendres, even when he wasn't.
Well, you gives me fever when you hold me tight. Fever in the morning, fever all through the night.
Benny's show grew organically of its own sort of innate power. His was the mind behind it, and he was the final arbiter of whatever went into the show. And the just undeniable massive success of the show for so many years is just one of those things that has people either biting the carpet with frustration because they can't think why it was that good, particularly other writers. Writers say, if I wrote that stuff, I wouldn't be able to sell it. But Benny could do it. Benny had a magic touch.
Really, he was a machine, an entertainment machine. He wanted to spend his days writing and performing and seeing other acts, listening to the radio, watching television. And he was happy doing that. He didn't really have much... Well, he didn't have much of a life apart from that, because when he went abroad, it was mainly to see what they were doing. He'd go to every show in Paris, and he'd go to shows in Madrid or wherever he was. Every night he'd go and see a show.
He spoke French, Spanish and German and French absolutely fluently. And he was all totally self-taught. He went into a second-hand shop and he bought a 10-shilling set of 78 records and brought them home. And lo and behold, within a few months, he'd perfected his French and he spoke fluent French. I never knew anybody else in the world who did it from records, but he did.
Before he became very successful in France and Spain, he would love to travel there. And he would just get on a bus in Spain and go all around the country and just write things on the back of a cigarette pack, watch people, sit at a bar, have a glass of wine, write something, and come back with his show.
You don't write with the pen, you write with your head first. And if I get an idea, I always jot it down on a bit of paper, because I know that will then be transferred to some books that I've got. And on one side of the page is V for visual, and the other side is the spoken word. And when I do get the idea, I mull it around in my mind for an awfully long time.
No, cut it out. I've got 8 minutes to lose. Well, let's see what happens next.
But he took his work extremely seriously. I do remember a sketch he gave me to do, because having started on the show, I think I had one line. And I think I had one line of a song, and I actually had to sort of work my way up, as of course he would have done in the 50s in these big shows. You'd have one line, and then by the end of the season, if you were good, you'd have a solo. And that's exactly how it worked. So it was like a rep company. And if you weren't very good, you weren't asked back. And it was as simple as that.
He was definitely a perfectionist. If something wasn't right, he would definitely make it clear that he wanted it fixed, whatever it happened to be, and he'd go very quiet. So we all knew when he wasn't happy, because he'd go into himself. He wouldn't do a big, yelling and screaming. He'd actually go into himself and he'd sort of chew his nails, and you could see, and everyone would go, oh dear, Benny's not happy, because he planned everything. It was his shows.
But if anyone came into the studio he didn't know, he would have to stop. And as you know, the Studio One was a very, very big studio, and sometimes the accountants come from downstairs at Thames, or someone would wander in, and he couldn't do it. He would actually have to stop and apologise and say, I'm terribly sorry, little heart, I don't know who you are, but would you mind leaving, because I really cannot do this if you're sitting there watching me. And it's bizarre, isn't it, to think of a man with so much success worldwide that just simply couldn't perform if there was someone he didn't know.
Welcome to Thames. Oh!
He used to really... His hands used to be absolutely soaking wet, and he used to perspire, and he was very nervous. He didn't particularly like, in later years, doing live performances. That's why he never used to get loads of offers, of course, to go and do theatre and cabaret, and people offered him thousands to do one-night stands in the hotels and things, and he just said no. He wasn't interested. He was very good with the audience, and he'd come on and do, in the studio, he'd come on and do his soliloquies and the opening and everything, and that was all live in front of an audience and recorded live. But he was very nervous about doing it. Very, very nervous. And he used to go to his dressing room before the show, and nobody really visited him. And after the show, he'd quietly leave. He wouldn't come out at that point, oh, let's have a drink, and he wanted to wind down on his own very quietly.
Just in case. Lovely. Now, do you get, like everybody else, you get recognised in queer places all the time?
I get recognised in all the places as well. Yes, all over the place. I get recognised. Sometimes, it's very nice, and sometimes it's not so pleasant, I mean, the case of perhaps you want to be quiet, you go into a restaurant for a nice quiet meal, you want to think something out, you might want to jot down some notes of scripture writing, You want a nice quiet meal, and somebody sees you and they're there, and they say, I do. It is, isn't it? I thought it was, yes. I've got a brother who plays the piano. It's very good, and they keep on and fire questions at you,
He hated being imposed on. That's what he really didn't like. If people got too close to him and wouldn't take no for an answer or just let him be himself. But I used to say to him, when it goes with the job, you shouldn't get so cross about it. But he was a very, very private man. His home was hilarious. I mean, it was the funniest thing ever. Hello, they would never got inside the door, nor they would okay, because they wouldn't have known what to do when they got in there.
I was always amazed because it's this very expensive chic part of London. And the flat was, simple, really simple. I remember a sofa, and I remember a table and a couple of chairs. I don't remember it very well, but I kept thinking to myself, my goodness, it's such a big, lovely flat, and there's nothing in here.
He had odd tastes in furniture. Nothing matched. But that was because he never went out and bought a whole thing. People used to give him, he used to open furniture shops, and they give him a chair, and he'd go somewhere else and they give him a sofa, not necessarily matching.
He never had a home. Home was where he slept. Benny had 3 suits, 1 sports jacket and a dinner jacket, and several odd pieces of furniture. He never had a home. That wasn't interesting to him. If he'd had a home, he'd have had a woman there, wouldn't he? Which he never did. Nobody ever lived with him.
Benny Hill remained a loner throughout his life, never marrying and shying away from serious relationships.
He was always, a bit of a girl chaser, which is why my social life and his didn't, because I was married and I'd been married for years, and Benny was still, if he could find a girl to chat up, he would. But then again, he was shy. It was a curious sort of combination.
Very often, if there was a young lady on the show, or that he just knew generally, and maybe I knew of her, Benny would actually discreetly ask me if I knew anything about the lady, what she was like, whether she had a boyfriend or not, because he was simply too shy to go up and ask her himself. So, in a way, if I could possibly vet a young lady for him, then I would do, because he felt it was in his own interest, that he was on safe ground.
What he said, he told me his joy was to find girls. Well, he said working class. I don't think you're allowed to use that phrase anymore today. But how do you replace it? He was talking about, he said factory girls or shop girls, girls who, I could take them to places they'd never seen. I could see their faces light up. I could take them to restaurants where they'd never been. I think the Cocoa House in Regent Street was about as swell as it got, but nevertheless, he did feel he was a white knight on a charger and a bit of a hero.
There's a lot in his shows that are written about him being the sad one and him being the one that never gets the girl or being the awkward one. And I think that's really how he saw himself in life.
He told me that he had proposed twice in his life and been turned down. And I think after that he got so used to his own ways, really. I can't imagine Benny being married, funnily enough. I can't visualise it at all.
He literally asked me to marry him, which was rather a surprise, but you see, I didn't take him seriously, because the way he asked me was covered with words or sentences that made it seem, you thought, well, is he, he's kind of doing a funny thing, or maybe he's not doing a funny thing.
Coming from the family he came from, I don't think Benny had ever got married. And I think he'd have been an awful husband, not because he wasn't a nice man, but because he was, and a very generous man. But I don't think he could bear anybody in his house all the time, when he was writing, when he wanted to watch TV, when he wanted to eat, when he wanted to do whatever. And I don't think the fact that he nearly got married meant anything at all.
The Benny Hill Show was going from strength to strength, but not everybody approved.
The family weren't proud of him. They were not proud of his success. They didn't like Benny being the star on the telly, or being that naughty Benny Hill, or that man who made people laugh. None of them liked what he did. And it really hurt, because he told me once, I remember saying, they were never proud of me. He didn't care what I did. And in fact, he thought sometimes maybe they were embarrassed by him. How sad. You know, and now he's one of the most famous men in the world.
In the late 1970s, the Benny Hill Show began to enjoy enormous success in America.
When I first found out the show was successful, I was absolutely delighted. I was thrilled because America was like the mecca of show business to me. I was brought up as a little child. Saturday afternoon, the cinema. Wednesday night with Mum and Dad, if I was lucky, and was sitting there sixpence at the dark. It was a big deal to me. So places like Hollywood and New York, were sort of places you only dream about.
Benny never realised what a vast audience he was going to tap into with this comedy. You see, there wasn't a single comedian in America giving them what they wanted. Sight gags, right across the board, whatever your nationality, whatever your language, sight gags worked, visual gags, visual humour, funny costumes, exaggerated sexual ideas, naughtiness.
The lovely surprise of being so well adored in America, and not just liked. I mean, the #1 show over there. That's never happened in this country before. And so people are jealous of it, and well, why hasn't so-and-so done it, and why haven't, they done it? And tough, they haven't, he did.
The spaghetti restaurant has a set meal at £4, and this includes the VAT, but not the TIP.
Police in New York told us that when they went off duty at night and they had to swap, they all used to do, hello viewers, and do that while they swapped their duties. And it became the thing with Benny, and everybody wanted to see, everybody in the street used to do the funny salute.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was a money. So sticky there. Too Lynn.
I think sometimes he found it a little bit frightening when he was on his own in a crowd. He went to a boxing match, I think, in Paris, and he was a little bit worried about that because someone suddenly went, look, do we Benny Hill? And suddenly the whole place turned around. And so it's about the only time I think he felt a little bit afraid, which I can imagine, I suppose, trying to imagine what that must be like. It's a bit, whoops, I've come here on my own and I've got to escape now. So, but he never complained about that, never talked about it. You just only knew how famous he was when you were out with him somewhere. Then you suddenly realise everyone going mad in the street.
But he wasn't an outgoing person, he was quiet. And when in the bar at Thames TV or somewhere, he'd meet the other comics, he'd come up sharp. Suddenly he'd become a slightly different person, and one-liners would flash around, to proving he could do it. But then, of course, all English comedians were in awe of the incredible worldwide success that Benny had.
He became much broader, and as soon as Thames were enjoying the kind of success they were, distributing his programmes, as they did for 20 years plus, and he was reaching other countries, particularly the Americas, he began to broaden even more and make this stuff even more accessible.
In the 1930s, when he was growing up, as far as he ever did grow up, poor old Ben, when he was growing up, pin-up magazines, that was the height of eroticism, was a girl showing her stockings, or showing the top of her stockings, If she showed half an inch above the top, that was considered very sort of daring. And I think Benny got a bit of a fixation on that, He probably wasn't on his own, because the audience seemed to like it as well.
In the 1980s, the Benny Hill Show began to attract a lot of criticism in the UK for being sexist and out of step with the new wave of political correctness in comedy.
Now forward. Tighten the bend, love, tighten the bend. That looked very good to me. All right to me.
It didn't really bother me. I just thought it was just brilliant, and I was in such a successful show. I didn't care, and I loved him so much. It didn't bother me at all, but it seemed to bother him terribly, terribly, and he didn't like it.
Benny was always very frustrated on people's reactions and their thoughts on the show. And unfortunately, if the public want to think of the Benny Hill show as a bevy of lovely ladies parading themselves with no clothes on, fine, that's what they want to think. But what the public didn't want to appreciate was that over the years, the shows, the format had actually changed.
Everybody on the floor. Down, on the floor, face down. Face down and you won't get hurt.
Miss Jones, face down. It's a bank raid, not the office party.
I think it was a little unfair because Benny originally, when he was doing all the runarounds and all those little saucy sketches, it was all very postcard humour, wasn't it? What we all consider postcard, your dumplings are boiling over, darling, all that sort of thing. And that was, I used to find all that carry-on humour quite funny at that time. And then there was a shift in sort of public opinion, wasn't there? Hot Gossip came out, which changed the dancing scene. Benny's girls at that time tried to sort of emulate that kind of thing, which perhaps wasn't the right thing to do. Who knows now, looking back. And it all became a bit tacky, I think.
Very good. Right there.
Towards the end, he did get lazy and he tended to rehash. Not only did he rehash, but Thames Television rehashed and rehashed and rehashed, so that when it said the Benny Hill half hour, I'd switch it on and it would be something I'd seen twice already. There was the best of Benny Hill and the cream of Benny Hill and Benny Hill Strikes Again, and they were the same bits and pieces re-put together and put out. So if his career folded, Thames TV were perhaps as much to blame for it as anybody.
The criticism didn't stop at Benny's shows. Benny himself was under attack from certain sections of the press for not living the kind of life expected of a multimillionaire.
He had a plastic devil on the mantelpiece. Then he used to put the cheques behind it. Richard Stone, his agent, would send through the cheques, and he'd put the cheques behind the plastic devil. And when it looked as if the devil was going to fall and shatter on the fireplace, he'd go, send the cheques in. He never even read them, didn't look at them. In those days, you had to endorse the back of them. Time and time again, the bank would come back and say, would you sign the back of these, Mr. Hill, because we can't cash them. Oh, it's too much bother.
I said, well, they send me pieces of paper with figures on it. He said, if I could open a door and look in a room and see £1 million, I know I had it. Whether that makes sense to you or not, I don't know. But that's how he was about money. He was not mean. He was extremely generous.
I think he was careful with money. He grew up without money and made a lot of it. And I think he was careful. He didn't spend it on himself, and I think he just thought there's no reason to spend a whole lot on other people as well. But I wouldn't say he was mean. No, that wasn't the impression I got.
The press were always trying to get stories out of Ben, and what they were looking for was something that wasn't there. They were always saying, who are you going out with in a minute? Why didn't you get married? Do you do this? Do you do that? Are you gay? Anything you like, And the fact was, it wasn't there. Benny was one of the most ordinary guys you'd ever meet in your life. His clothes were ordinary. He would talk about football. He'd go out the road and do his shopping. And people didn't want to accept that there was nothing more to it than that.
He wasn't a fashionable person at all. He'd just wear... I would die. I would think, oh my Lord, what's he doing coming out in that? But that's what he was like. He wasn't materialistic. He didn't crave for fashion wear or wonderful furniture or fancy cars. He just lived his life as he wanted to. That was him.
Next week's strip. What a lot of rubbish! Rubbish!
He used to describe himself as, I'm a normal, ordinary bloke, really. I'm just an ordinary bloke. But he wasn't an ordinary bloke. A, he was a man for whom solitude was a genuine joy, and B, he was an obsessive, and he was really obsessive-eccentric, because nobody actually chooses, I think, to be alone that much, or to be unconnected with any other human being at a deep emotional level to that degree.
He was the only person I know, I've ever known, the only human who was totally self-contained. He needed nobody, nothing, until he wanted them, and then fine. But he wasn't a user of people. It was never an affront when he called you and said, "Do you want to come to lunch, or do you want to come to dinner?" He needed people when he needed them, but he was quite happy, completely happy with his own company, night after night after night, in that flat, just working.
In 1989, Benny Hill's relationship with Thames Television, for whom he'd worked for over 20 years, came to an abrupt end.
I really got quite a surprise. I went in at 10 o'clock. I think I came out at about 2 minutes past 10, having been told thank you and for several, reasons. Business is business, and I don't mind, them saying we've had enough, or we can't afford it, or whatever. But I would have liked a little bit of a small pat on the back, because I'd been there for 22 years.
He was just absolutely distraught. I think he took himself away for a holiday just to get away out of the country because he couldn't bear to be over here. He couldn't bear to answer phone calls because basically he didn't know what to say to anybody.
When this happened, it was such a blow. I was worried about him because he just bought this flat next door to the studio, so it was actually right on his doorstep. And there's nothing worse or more cruel than having to walk past the same building every day, which is what he had to do. I was worried about his health. I was worried about him getting very upset about it, and blood pressure, and, It's the same of anyone 60-something being made redundant, but I think the way it was done was so appallingly bad. And he went in there in on his own without an agent or without the director. He was just summoned in like a little boy. Thank you very much, but that's it. Unbelievable.
He never recovered from it, there's no doubt about that. There was something missing from him. His normal relaxed twinkle had gone. It had to be put on. He was never quite the same jolly creature. He was always a bit looking over his shoulder. And without a doubt, it helped to destroy him.
He didn't drink when I first met him. He didn't. He said it clouded the mind. But towards the end of his life, he'd get through a bottle and a half of wine a day, and that with the food he ate. I suppose he didn't care. He said, "I've had a good life, I'm not that worried." He used to say, "I don't mind flying anywhere." He said, "If it crashes, what the hell?" He said, "I've had a good life." He'd done everything he wanted to do. There wasn't anything much left to do but eat.
He was eating an awful lot at that particular time because I think he viewed food as a comfort. When he was upset or lonely, he would eat. That was a solace. And I was shocked when I saw how much weight he had put on. But I didn't think it was going to be leading up to something so drastic.
Hello, yours!
In February 1992, Benny spent time in hospital after a series of heart attacks.
I think he knew there was something seriously wrong with him, although he never said. I met his doctor, who I believe has passed away now, at the funeral, and he said he knew. I believe that he was so intelligent, he was such an astute man, I don't think he could not have known.
Benny Hill died alone in his flat on April the 21st, 1992, aged 68.
There was lots of close friends there. It was lovely. And it was in Southampton where his parents lived and where he loved to go. I remember being behind him in the car. And, of course, it was a big thing in Southampton that day because everyone knew it was his funeral. And there were some children. They were only about 10 or 11. And they were standing by. And as he went by, they went like that. I thought it was so sweet.
He was ambitious to keep up a standard. That's what it was with Benny, standards. He wanted to keep the fire to the height, right to the end. And he tried to do that.
Benny was probably the most isolated comedian, but not the loneliest, not the saddest. A man supremely at home with himself and loving what he did. He had a wonderful life. Everything he did came true and worked.
3 mums in Scotland reckon they've got what it takes, not just with their singing, but their moves too. But can they impress the judges? They're giving it a go at 6:50 when the X Factor continues. And coming up after the news, we've got more funniest ever You've Been Framed. I kid you not.